Well, the process by which we got here was incredibly messy, but Ukraine is back to being in a relatively good position, all things considered. And now the Kremlin is about to be in a bit of a dilemma. We have entered the put up or shut up time in the war. Let me explain. Following a comparatively harmonious summit between Ukraine and the United States, Ukraine agreed, in principle, to a 30-day ceasefire with Russia. The United States, in return, announced that it was going to restore military aid and intelligence sharing with Kyiv, just 11 days after this fiasco in the Oval Office that led to those things getting cut off. Obviously, more military aid and more intelligence is better for Ukraine than less military aid and less intelligence. But there is a deeper gambit that is being run right now that we should shed some light on. As you likely know, Russia has been advancing along the Eastern Front for a long time now. The central problem is that Ukraine has been unable to establish solidified defensive lines. So, in the absence of that, Ukraine has been trading land for time and Russian casualties. We do not yet know how long Russia can sustain those operations, but as long as the status quo holds, it will be a slow march westward for Russian forces. With that as background, the next step in the peace process is for Special Envoy to the Middle East Steve Witkoff to travel to Moscow, which is somehow now falling under his purview. Actually, he was also there last month to negotiate the release of Mark Fogel. That turned out to be a success, as you can see him here kissing American land for the first time in 3.5 years, and while wearing a very tasteful beanie, might I add. Regardless, you can see Steve Witkoff here on the left at the US-Russia summit in Saudi Arabia from February 18th. He will now go to Putin and propose the same 30-day ceasefire, and it will put Putin in a bind. Let's imagine for a second that he says yes to the proposal. Well, if I may be Captain Obvious of the Armchair Squadron for a moment, that will give 30 days for Ukraine to dig, and dig some more. And then when they are done digging, they can keep on digging. A month is not enough to fully entrench all of the front, of course. By comparison, the Surovikin line that Russia used to stop Ukraine's offensive in 2023 had about 6 months of lead time. But 30 days is more than nothing, and it is arguably the most likely reason why Russia has not been pushing for a ceasefire yet. And if you will indulge me with some lines on maps for a second, the thing is, if you think that by fighting right now you could expect to capture territory out to here, but if you think that if you pause and Ukraine builds entrenchments, then you will suddenly be limited to here or so, then you may refuse a deal even if continued fighting will lead to a lot more casualties on your side. Now, should the ceasefire end in 30 days, perhaps the shift will not be all that massive. But if you are going to be fighting now or later, Russia is better off taking whichever circumstances produce the greatest gains. Thus, option 1 for the Kremlin is to forego the continued pressing of Ukrainian defenses, and allow Ukraine to build at least some fortifications. So, not great from Putin's perspective. Meanwhile, the alternative is to just keep going. And that is where things get spicy. Publicly, the Trump administration wants the war to end one way or another. The threat laid out in Special Envoy to Ukraine Keith Kellogg's peace plan is to massively increase aid to Ukraine should Russia refuse. And I should emphasize threat in that sentence, because there is a big difference between a threat made and a threat followed through on. Certainly, everything that is discussed within the Western policy community is that the Trump administration has done little to signal that it actually wants to increase aid to Ukraine, beyond merely saying so. Yep, we must once again break out the cliché to stop listening to what leaders say and start watching what they do. Here, the best way to signal that you mean what you say is to proactively arm Ukraine to the hilt, and threaten that such armaments will continue until Russia agrees to the ceasefire. And maybe that will be what happens in the next few days, though a limited time signal is also of limited utility. In the absence of something stronger, Witkoff's task is to somehow convince Russia that the United States will do that arming, despite the lack of credible evidence so far. The bind for the Kremlin is that an outright rejection tells everyone in the West who was previously unsure on this point that Russia is not serious about a peace plan. That means a more united NATO front in dealing with the situation, and the risk that the Trump administration follows along and floods the zone with military aid. And even if Trump passes on those shipments to Kyiv, it will undoubtedly halt any further progress in thawing relations between the United States and Russia, which would come with the benefit of perhaps reducing economic sanctions and opening up its oil and gas industry to international markets. Now, if you are asking me which of those is more likely to happen, I do not know. To answer that question, I would need to be privy to the intelligence that is circulating around the Kremlin, and it turns out that they do not invite me to their meetings. What I can tell you is that we are entering a high-leverage situation right now. Either the Kremlin agrees to the ceasefire, and some bargaining power immediately shifts back into Ukraine's camp thanks to those entrenchments, or the Kremlin calls Trump's bluff, and what happens after that depends on whether the Trump administration actually ramps up aid, which will either be very good for Ukraine or very bad. Either way, high leverage, like I said. To try to narrow expectations somewhat here, an outright rejection from the Kremlin would be surprising. It would be better to agree on the face of it, and then try having the plan fall apart on the battlefield, and leave it to the rest of the world to figure out exactly what happened. The fog of war is great for that, and we only have to go back to the Minsk agreements to see why. Alternatively, the Kremlin could try bogging down the discussion in negotiations over the finer points of a deal, such as how much aid will flow to Ukraine during the ceasefire, or what NATO's role will be along the line of control moving forward. And speaking of enforcement along the line of control, if the 30-day ceasefire does come to fruition, that does not mean an end of the war. There is very little discussion about what that looks like from the United States at the moment. Europe has spent a lot more time focusing on peacekeeping forces over the last few weeks. Kellogg's plan calls for continued armament over the long run to keep the line of control steady, and that is something that will need to happen to hedge against long-run shifts in the balance of military power that could be favorable to Russia. You could be in a situation where the Kremlin agrees to the 30-day ceasefire, uses the time to reload to the best of its abilities while Ukraine is working on entrenchments, and then restart the war afterward, with complaints about NATO and Ukraine violating some of the finer points of the deal. Sure, it might not be ideal from the Kremlin's perspective to give Ukraine the time to work on defensive fortifications, but perhaps that will not come off as obviously contrary to Trump's vision, which may mean less of a response from the United States. Look, from the very start of the invasion, at a time when it was not particularly popular to say this, I have been insisting that a negotiated settlement, tacit by a frozen line of control or formalized by a treaty with signatures, would be the most likely outcome of this war, if for no other reason than because that is how almost all of these kinds of conflicts end. Today, for the first time in more than 3 years, which I will note is also on the longer end of the spectrum of these kinds of wars, we might be seeing the first section of the chapter on the war's resolution. And, I had a chapter about that when the war first started. Maybe we should revisit it sometime. Or at least for now, you can check the video description and start doing that on your own. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And I will see you next time. Take care.